Okay. For the time being, I don't have any cats bothering me. I don't think it's going to last too terribly long, though. Okay, so today we are going to begin reading the book of Judges. So we're back now on our timeline, so to speak. We read the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis to Deuteronomy. And then we took a detour and read the book of Job. It's impossible to say exactly who wrote the book of Job. There's an ancient tradition that Moses did. I'm not sure if I buy that. It's possible. Job probably was a contemporary of Moses, probably lived around the same time the Israelites were in Egypt, during their time in Egypt. Some people will tell you that Job was a contemporary of Abraham, but that's very unlikely, actually impossible, since Job and his friends were descendants of Abraham's grandson Esau. Job himself could not have been a contemporary of Abraham. Anyway, so we read Job. We took a detour to read Job. We read through Genesis, Deuteronomy, and then the book of Joshua, which themselves, as a unit, kind of tell a complete story. The whole point of those first 6 books of the Bible is basically to tell the story of the Israelites arriving in the land. From the time the Bible begins, you have the prologue section, the early chapters setting up everything. Then you get into the story of Abraham, and from that point onward, the Bible becomes a record of the Israelites taking possession of the land that God had promised them. And that culminates at the end of Joshua. And you could, as I said when we finished Joshua, you could pretty much, that's a complete story by itself. So you could almost finish the story right there and just kind of leave it off and say that's done. You know, that's a completed story in and of itself. Moses wrote the first 5 books, got them all the way up to the promised land, gave them the law, which is essentially their constitution as a nation, made the covenant with God. You know, it was during his day that they made the covenant with God that he would be their king and they would be his people. And one of the things he was going to do for them as their king was to give them this land, which he had promised their ancestor Abraham he would do many hundreds of years earlier. Moses himself doesn't go all the way. He can only take them to the promised land, can't take them in the promised land. Joshua finishes the task. Then they take the promised land, they divide it amongst themselves for their inheritances, and that is where the book of Joshua ends. And like I said, you could kind of take that as like a complete unit. Like that whole section of scripture tells a complete story in of itself. And then during this time, we detoured to the book of Job, took a look at what some of the people in the nations around Israel thought about God at that time, and how that story was passed around, and how humans in that day dealt with the questions of suffering, which we still deal with today. We still haven't quite figured out how to wrap our heads around suffering. So now we're going, oh my goodness. Do you really, is it just necessary? Do you have to do this, Kat? I guess you do. Here, let me get this stuff out of the way. If you have to do this, at least let me get that out of the way. Okay, so now we are moving on with the timeline of Israel, and we're reading the book of Judges. The book of Judges covers a fairly long amount of time, longer than the history of the United States of America. I mean, this is a 400-ish year time span we're going to be covering here in about 20 pages. It's impossible to... There's a lot about the book of Judges that is still, to this day, very mysterious, and will always be mysterious. Because the book of Judges kind of exists in its own little world. Okay, when we get down to the days of the king, so the book of Judges essentially covers a span of time. Oh, excuse me, my nose. Covers a span of time from between the death of Joshua and the Israelites entering the land. Actually, the beginning of Judges will kind of serve as an addendum to the end of the book of Joshua. It covers a period of time from when they first got into the land, the generation of Joshua and thereafter, to right up before the days of the monarchy, which gets picked up in the story of First. Why do you have to get into everything? I put that there so you wouldn't get into it. Just, oh goodness, cats are so annoying. Leave that alone, please. Leave that alone, please. See, I don't. I could just put them right out the door here. There's a door right behind me. You can see. Please leave that alone. Please leave that alone. Please leave that alone. I could put them right out the door. Okay, I could get them out of the room, but you know what would happen if I did that? They would sit, that one in particular, would sit right at the doorway and meow and scratch the whole time. Okay, like, there is nothing I could do about that. The only thing I could do would be to get up and go chase her, but that would reward her for doing that. I don't want to do that. I don't want to reward them for bad behavior. So it's like, there's nothing I can do. Okay? She's going to pester me. I don't have enough space in this apartment to just get them away from me for a while. Like, it can't be done. So it's just constant pestering. Unless they're asleep, which they're not taking their afternoon naps yet, so they're just, ugh. Anyway, yeah, just go away. Just get out of my hair. Okay. Anyway. So the book of Judges covers the time period from between the entry into the land and the generation of Joshua and right afterwards to the time right before the monarchy, that's the story of 1 Samuel, was the beginning of the monarchy. That covers, we don't know when Joshua died. We know how old he was when he died, as he was 110, but we don't have any fixed points in his life. We don't know really how to date Joshua because we don't have any way. Now Caleb, who is a contemporary Joshua, probably younger than him though, does tell us that there was 45 years between he was 40 when he went to go, he was one of the scouts, as was Joshua, and he was 40 when he was told to go scout the land with the rest of the spies, and then he's 85 when he gets his inheritance. So Caleb gives us a 45-year window there, in which we can say, okay, that was 45 years between this event and that event. If Joshua is Caleb's age, we could paste Joshua's age on top of Caleb's and fit him into the same time frame. Joshua is probably not Caleb's age, though. He's probably older than Caleb, but we don't really know for sure. It's impossible. So we have Joshua's death age, 110, but we don't have any way to fix that to our chronology. And there's nothing in Judges, unfortunately, that allows us to fix any of it to a chronology. And the years in Judges don't add up to the amount of years they need to be in order to cover that time span between the fall, the arrival of the Israelites and the establishment of the monarchy. So we're kind of guessing. When it comes to the chronology of Judges, we're just guessing. Now later on, when we get to the Kings, we're going to get detailed information about the years of the Kings. And to such a degree, in fact, that we can create a timeline for the Kings. And the Kings, of course, have contact with other nations, whose records we also have. And by comparing, by looking at all these records and comparing them with each other, and then looking at some of the eclipse data that some of the other nations, Israelites didn't really follow eclipse data, but the other nations did. And so by looking at their records and figuring out what years their kings were in when certain astronomical events happened, that we can calculate because the astronomical calendar is the same as it's always been. So we can fix a timeline around all that. We'll talk about that when we get down to the Kings. And the Kings, we do have enough information about all the kings from David onward. We don't really have information about Saul. But from the kings of David onward, we have enough information combined in the scriptures themselves to date them, combined with other records of other nations around them and the astronomical dates that we can stick some of those records to. We can create a timeline. In fact, we have created a timeline. Now, we'll get to that when we get to the Kings. And we have a very solid timeline for the Kings. Which is something we should feel good for, because for many years of history, for over 2,000 years of history, 2,200 years of history, in fact, we didn't have a solid timeline for the Kings. We were as clueless about the Kings as we were about the Judges. But that's not the case anymore. We can be very certain about the dates of the Kings, thanks to some of the work done in the 20th century by certain scholars, namely Edwin Thiele. We'll get to that when we get to that. Today, we're talking about the Judges. And unfortunately, unlike the Kings, the Judges don't give us enough. The book of Judges does not give us enough information about the Judges to be able to date, even in reference to each other. So, the Kings, when we get to the Kings, we'll date each other according to the Kings, the other Kings. And they'll talk about the year of the king, and the year he rose, and the year he fell, or and his son, and all that. And then when the kingdom splits into two, and we have two kingdoms, they're going to compare the dates for each other. So we have ways of comparing the dates of the kings. We do not have any ways of comparing the dates of the judges. And another thing to consider is that the title, the office of judge, is not quite like the office of king. There's only one king. Now, eventually the kingdom will split, and there will be two kings, one in each kingdom. But there can be many judges. Okay, like there's no real limit to how many judges there can be. A judge is basically a leader. In many cases, it has a military context, but not necessarily. We run all the way back when they were at Mount Sinai, and Moses' father-in-law told him to appoint judges over the people, and that was right after they came out of Egypt. And can assign them over units of 100 or 50 or whatever. And so the idea of like a leader or a governor or a judge or someone just to handle disputes, like there can be many of those. Okay, like that's not limited to just one guy at a time, and maybe his son is co-regent, which is what's going to happen in the days of the kings. You could have a judge in one area of the country and a judge in another area of the country. And there is just honestly no way to tell how many of these judges were consecutive, like back to back to back to back to back, and how many of them overlapped. We're going to get lots of periods of years in the book of Judges, but there is just no honest way to parse through all that and determine which judge was active at what point in time and all that, and where the other judges were. And the book of Judges is also very regional, very local. It's not dealing with it is dealing with Israel as a whole. The whole point of the book of Judges is to demonstrate how the conditions in Israel as a whole were deteriorating throughout this time period. But the individual conflicts that are recorded in Judges are local in nature. The judges do not seem to have authority over the entire nation or all 12 tribes at once. It doesn't seem like it. Different judges had different spheres of influence, but they all seem to be more regional and provincial than national in nature, like the kings will be. Some judges are going to be active in the north, and some judges are going to be active in the south. And it's possible that they were active at the same time. We just don't know. Okay? We just don't know. Basically, though, the period of the judges spans from about the year, let's say 1350. If the conquest ended, okay, so the Exodus happened in 1446 BC. They were sentenced to wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. That takes us on to 1406 BC. Caleb says that he was 45 years. He was one of the spies who went into the land and came back. He came back with a good report. The rest of them came back with a negative report. And they were sentenced to 40 years of wandering. He says at one point there was 45 years since then, so he's 85. That's near the end of the conquest. So let's say then that the conquest ended around 1400 BC. We can't be particularly certain of that, but that's a pretty good estimate. Joshua lived for some period of time after that. We have no idea how long, whether it was 2 years, 20 years, or 40 years. He lived to be 110, but we don't know how old he was at any points in his life. We saw him as far back as Moses. He was Moses' assistant at Mount Sinai. He may have even been Moses' assistant before Moses left Egypt, when he was a prince of Egypt. Who knows? We really just don't have any idea. So even though we have Joshua's age at his death, that doesn't help us very much in forming chronology, because we have no idea how to fix his years to any of the events that occur in Exodus through Joshua. But at any rate, he dies, and then all the leaders of his generation die after him. And that you would think would take a few years, okay? So maybe we're down to about 1380 to 1360 BC. At the end of the book of Judges, we're going to have a story which features Phinehas as the high priest. And Phinehas was alive in the days of Joshua. So that story, at least, has to happen pretty early in the book of Judges. So we're just going to round it off and say the book of Judges covers a span of time from about 1350 BC to 1050 BC, which is around the time of Samuel. And we'll get to Samuel when we get to Samuel. So we're talking about 300 years, maybe a little bit more than that. There's going to be a character later in the book of Judges who talks about it having been 300 years since the Israelites started moving into the land. It's a guy named Jepthah. And we don't know, but when we get to there, we'll see. We don't know if we can But that may not be an accurate number. We can't be certain about that either. So even though we get a number there from a guy, 300 years, we can't even be certain about that. So we just can't be certain about any of it. We can't be certain about any of it. That doesn't mean that the book of Judges didn't happen, though, or that it's all made up. The smart people of the day will, of course, tell you that. That's just how they operate. That's just what they always default to. Always. That's always what they default to. So you could predict what the smart people are going to say, because they will always say some version of that. Always will, every single time, without fail. Anyway, so the smart people will tell you that it was all made up afterwards or something like that, but there's no reason to believe that either. Now, it is true, though, the book of Judges may not have been written down until many years later. Who knows? We don't know who wrote the book of Judges either. Probably it was originally written by Samuel, who was the last judge and the guy who paved the way for the kings. Probably. But he probably also wasn't the only one to work on this book. This book clearly, this book itself takes place over the span of several hundred years. So no one person could have been responsible for writing down everything that happened, because we're talking about a span of time for 300 to 400 years. So even if Samuel undertook the effort of compiling the material for the first time, even that would still be the work of other people having either told stories or written them down for centuries already at that point. And even if Samuel did write down the bulk of what we know as the book of Judges, clearly, we'll find evidence within the book that somebody had to have edited it or updated it at a later point in time, regardless, because it talks about the exile, which, of course, Samuel didn't live anywhere near the exile in time. So Samuel could have been responsible for originally compiling this material into a written form, but was not responsible for finishing it in the form that we have it today. And we're going to have to get used to this, because several of the books in this part of the Bible are going to be like this. So now, up until now, we have been on relatively solid footing when it comes to who we think wrote the books of the Bible, okay? The Bible itself is pretty clear that Moses wrote Genesis and Deuteronomy. Again, there were some edits and updates later, okay, that clearly could not have been done by him, but most of it was from him. Of course, the smart people won't say that, but again, that's just what they always say. Joshua was likely either written by Joshua himself or maybe by the priest who was with him at the time, Phinehas. Parts of it, of course, would have been finished after Joshua's time, probably by Phinehas or maybe someone who outlived him. Job, we really didn't know, but it was probably written by somebody who, as he said at the time, knew about the story of Job the Edomite, from the Edomites and all that. And Job is a story anyway. It's a wisdom book. It doesn't really even matter to a certain degree who wrote it. But now we're going to be getting into the history books of the Bible, the history books of the Old Testament, which for the most part do not have an author and do not really give any clues to an author. Some of the later ones will, but these don't. The Judges and Ruth and Samuel and Kings, we really don't know who wrote any of this stuff. So get used to this. Get used to this ambiguity and this uncertainty in terms of the authors. And this is the sort of thing that probably was updated later on. Even if there was an original author who was responsible for compiling the bulk of it, it was certainly edited and updated later by people who lived later on. And we just don't know. We just can't say that for any of that for certain. But again, that's not any reason to doubt these events happened, or that this material is history, that these things actually happened in their history. The smart people, of course, will doubt that, but there's no reason to. That's just your own bias. The book of Judges is very dark. It's a very dark book. Very unpleasant book. In fact, the book of Judges contains some of the most unpleasant material in the entire scriptures, actually. And that's actually the point. The point of the book of Judges is to show how the situation in Israel was deteriorating and declining, and the results of that. Okay, the people did not finish. The people from the very beginning, even at the end of Joshua, the people did not fully take the land like they're supposed to, and that caused them problems. They left these other people groups in the land to cause them problems, and they continued to cause problems for hundreds of years. And the whole point of the book of Judges is to show how the Israelites were compromised themselves, were not completely faithful to God, gave up their commitment to Jehovah, their covenant God, and how that became more and more of an issue and all the problems that resulted from that. And so it's not a nice book. It's not a pleasant book. It's not a book that's designed to stimulate. It's not a book that's designed to make us feel good about ourselves or make us feel good about Israel or whatever. I think sometimes, and even the judges themselves, like, these aren't really great guys, okay? I think a lot of times we tend to get, because it's a very military-themed book, I think, because the judges oftentimes have the role of like a military leader. And that speaks to us. I think that speaks to a certain type of dude's mindset. And so I think partially because there is a strong military theme to this book, we have a tendency to kind of take these judges and preach about them as though they're meant to be role models. But they're really not. I mean, I remember growing up, and even I've seen lots of books portraying Samson, for example, as a hero. But he really honestly isn't a hero. Okay? And as the book goes on, the judges that we talk about get worse and worse in quality. Samson's the last one, so he's the worst one. And starting, as the book goes on, like, the judges kind of decline. The conditions in the land decline, and the judges decline. And guys like Gideon and Jepthah and Samson really aren't heroes. Not to the degree that we often preach them as. And the judges themselves fail in keeping Israel afloat spiritually, keeping them from apostatizing. That's a fancy word, pretty much means giving up God, turning away from God to other gods or whatever. The judges really aren't able to stop that from happening. And so the book is very dark, it's very violent, very brutal. Lots of brutality in this book, lots of brutality against women in this book. Women are often, Judges is interesting to analyze in terms of how it frames its characters. And we'll see in this particular context, as the book goes on, women go from being inspirers, inspiring men, or being leaders themselves, in the case of Deborah, to being victims of violent, horrible violence. And I think it's, again, designed to show us how the conditions in the country get worse and worse and worse. And how that reflects itself, for example, in the treatment of women. And so that happens, and just in general, it's a very violent, very brutal, very dark book. And in fact, it's some of the most brutal and dark stuff in all the Bible. I mean, we're going to cover a lot more after this. There's a lot of violent stuff, but there's to come. But a lot of the most violent stuff in the entire Bible happens here in the book of Judges. It doesn't get a lot worse than this. This is a very dark book, very unpleasant book, very unpleasant subject matter, very dark lesson, very, very negative. I mean, we're all the people here, most of them, are going to be held up essentially as negative examples, not good guys, but role models in the sense of don't do what these guys did. Don't be like Samson. Don't be like... Now, I know that their names are listed in Hebrews chapter 11. So we often get this idea that these were big heroes that we're supposed to follow, but they're really not, in all honesty. The writer of the book of Judges, I don't think, is holding up these people as inspirations that we're supposed to follow. If anything, we're supposed to model our behavior by doing what they didn't do, by not doing what they did. And also the book of Judges is interested in showing what happens when Israel does not accept God as king. As the book goes on, more and more we're going to read. It doesn't happen at the beginning of the book, but as the book goes on, more and more we're going to be reading this sentence, something along the lines of, in those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And yeah, there is a certain element of looking forward to a king like David who will come along and set things right, at least for a while. And there is an element of that, okay? There's an element of that. But beyond that, it really points to how the Israelites gave up having God as their king. When they formed that covenant, when they agreed to that covenant with God at Sinai, they were saying that God was going to be their king. He was going to be their ruler. They were going to be his servant, his vassal. It was a master-servant sort of covenant relationship. They were going to obey him and follow him, and he was going to provide for them and take care of them. He was going to be their king, and they were going to be his people. So, and the book of Judges demonstrates that they did not follow that. They did not make him their king. So yeah, there is a certain element of you longing for a king. You could say that this constant reference to no king does point to the monarchy, which is to come. So that is true. But beyond that, it has a broader scope than that. And the real emphasis of it is showing how the Israelites gave up having God as their king. And this is what happened. This state of anarchy and chaos and confusion is what happened. And that's essentially what's going on in our country today. We gave up having God as our king, or having God as our guide. And look at what's happening to us today. Okay, we're getting to the point in the Bible, not yet, but we're nudging there. That I'm really looking forward to getting into the kings and the prophets, which is where we're heading after this, because that's really a lot of what I want to spend time on and talk about in these video lessons. Because I see a lot of similarities, a lot of parallels between our culture today and Israel's culture in that time. And a lot of the warnings that the prophets gave Israel, I think, are very applicable to where we are today. Now, we're not a covenant nation of God. So we aren't bound by the law of Moses. God only ever made one covenant with people as a nation in this sense. But I think God's standards of dealing with the nations have not changed. I don't believe they've changed, even in the church age. I don't believe that God's standards of dealing with the nations as entities have changed. We'll get to that later. I'm not, that's getting away from my point at the moment. But Judges is kind of bridging that gap between the entering into the land and the monarchy. And this is a long period of time. We're talking 300 to 400 years that we're going to cover in about 20 pages. And the chronology is vague, and the years do not add up sequentially to the right period of time. So we know there has to be overlap between them. But there's no way to fix any of these events to other events in the Bible or other events that we know about from extra biblical history. So a lot of this is very mysterious and murky, which again fits because this is a period of chaos and anarchy. So the fact that we cannot be certain about a lot of this stuff and where it fits sequentially or chronologically in the timeline is actually pretty fitting for this subject matter and for this material. And this is there is another book after this called Ruth, which takes place sometime during the book of the Judges. And then, other than that, this is the only material we have that really covers this time period. So we're going to be covering 300 to 400 years of history, and about 20, which is longer than the entire history of this nation that I live in today, the United States. So we're going to be covering the entire a period of history that is longer than our entire history as a nation in about 20 pages. So there's not a lot of time for detail, and we're going to only be covering a few specific things, incidents, and people. And it's going to be mysterious, it's going to be murky, it's going to be chaotic, it's going to be anarchic. And it's going to be bloody, it's going to be brutal, it's going to be violent, it's going to be vicious, and we just got to be prepared for that. So that's the intro to the book of Judges.